In this presentation, I will summarize and discuss some of the major points presented by Philip Ayub in his book, When States Come Out. His analysis essentially traces the progress toward LGBT equality across European states. And he takes a really an interesting perspective to view the process of what a lot of scholars call policy diffusion. This first slide here really is to give you some idea of the institutions of multi-level governance that you find within the European Union. It's a pretty complicated bureaucratic institution that really has a lot of moving parts and a lot of decision-making bodies, and that's sometimes a positive thing for minority groups because it gives them multiple channels of access to the European government. And as we will discuss, there is a limited but still significant influence that the EU as an organization has on its member states. So there is a very interesting discussion about both formal and informal ways of influencing policy of its members. So the major research question that this author is asking is, we see a significant amount of what we would call policy diffusion. This is where states adopt the policies that other states are experimenting with or have had success with. And in the case of the European Union, there are different theoretical explanations behind why LGBTQ has become one of those types of policies that has gained traction in other states through what seems to be like state-to-state influence. So the question is, why do these policies get diffused? The assumption being that there is a norm underlying the political, meaning the acceptance of this group as an important part of society, or at least an accepted part of society. And so there are a few different perspectives on why this happens. The first is kind of what they call the hard law approach, and that is simply that international law and transnational actors have kind of had a top-down influence on the lower states. So there's sort of this supranational structure of the European Union, and these member states are subservient to that rule. There's also an argument based on institutions that to become more competitive in the European Union as a market requires states that may not be as quote-unquote progressive socially to adopt some of these measures in order to make their workforce and their societies attractive to foreign investment. So that's one perspective. The social movement arguments would focus on the resources that the European Union offers to LGBT movements, both for kind of lobbying purposes, but also that as the European Union creates sort of an open political opportunity structure, this encourages movements. Now, the author points out that it doesn't necessarily seem to work that way in the case of all policy adoptions for in the European Union for LGBTQ plus rights. In fact, sometimes it seems that there's agitation from below that makes this happen. So the political process, political opportunity idea is important, but it may not be capturing all of what's going on. And the perspective that the book puts forth is that it is really a combination of social movements and an international institutions or hard law look at this case. It really requires understanding how transnational and international norms become visible across states. And they look at really kind of individual hypotheses around why homosexuals gay people, trans people, lesbians become more accepted, that contact hypothesis that we've talked about before. And they kind of write this large to the level of the state. And they also look at how interactions between elites and institutions, and elites at the European Union, elites in other states, have had the impact of forwarding policy within European states. So important people, important actors that they identify include transnational organizations and norm brokers. These are activists that cross state lines. We'll talk more about those. But there's also a considerable question and issue that they point out, that the attempt of activists and policymakers within the European Union to influence states is not uniform. There are sometimes what they call norm polarization effects, which is kind of an extreme form of backlash. And they note this taking place in some countries in Africa, but they also note how Russia has sort of reacted on the opposite end in terms of the influence. They have sort of strengthened their discriminatory policies toward LGBTQ persons. So that's an important consideration going forward too as well. And more or less to my point, this map of Europe includes the Russian state. And this actually comes from rainboweurope.org. And this is the International Lesbian and Gay Association. And they're a very important European international organization. And their index really shows sort of the degree of variation across Europe in terms of the level of policies adopted in favor of LGBTQ. So the closer you are to the red spectrum, the fewer policies you've adopted, and you see that Russia really represents kind of the basement here, and the darker green represents the most protections for LGBTQ persons. So as I mentioned before, the European Union is a supranational institution that allows for a platform and a forum for both elites, the representatives, people who work within European Union institutions, and people who work within transnational advocacy networks to come together and organize and both influence their member states, but also have an influence on the European Union's decision-making processes. And this is the process of Europeanization, the process of adopting European-wide policies and attempting to kind of create not necessarily a homogenous culture, but especially when it comes to human rights, a harmonized culture that recognizes throughout this region everyone's rights. And so this is done in vertical ways and also horizontal processes. So you see that through formal rules and institutions that exist at the level of the EU. You also see it through the building of civil society organizations that then lobby the EU. And you also see it in the horizontal process as people are able by EU directives to move freely across state lines and interact with one another. This has led to greater exposure of individuals to LGBTQ persons. It has also led to greater organizational capacity and network building between movement organizers. And so there are kind of multiple levels and multiple ways, and also feedbacks back to the EU that make this a really kind of complicated socialization process. In this graphic, the author is visualizing how visibility channels that are created through these transnational networks, the European Union institutions, how they might compel states to comply with either the formal norms or the informal norms, because we have both happening. You have decisions that are being made, which we'll talk about momentarily, at the level of the European Union. And some of those must be followed by every state. Not everyone needs to be followed by every state. But there is still sometimes voluntary adoption of these rules that push further than the EU does. So that would be, it may be sometimes a case of informal influence, but this is an interesting sort of interaction between transnational advocacy networks, the role of norm brokers and activists, and the role that Europe can play as sort of a forum and also as an institutional rulemaker. But going back to the early point about polarization that can occur with norms, the reaction that a state might have to attempted influence by transnational advocacy networks or EU directives could be one of resistance, and a lot of that really sort of depends on how norm brokers are interacting and what type of existing structure is already there. Your author points out that resistance is most likely where religion has been a very important part of national identity. So the influence of outsiders is not absolute. It really depends on how the receiving country perceives of the level of threat to its identity. On the left in this graphic, you see the theoretical amount of threat perceived by society. And then on this top axis, the channels of visibility. So where channels of visibility are low, but threat is low, you'll see low amounts of change in a country. But where there's low amounts of threat, but actors are very high and the EU's activities are very publicized in a country, then you'll actually see that states might internalize these norms and become more tolerant of LGBT and prefer LGBTQ equality rights. On the other hand, if there is high amount of threat and low amount of visibility, then there will be resistance in that state. And there may require then high amounts of visibility in order for there to be kind of a cautious acceptance of LGBTQ rights. Keep in mind that backlash against visibility increases visibility, as the author points out. So sometimes backlash actually can result in a public debate that involves really kind of an awakening to these issues where awareness was really not there before. There are a multitude of ways that LGBT rights have become enshrined as part of the norms and values of the European Union. Beginning in 1981 with the case of Dudgeon versus the United Kingdom, where the Court of Human Rights ruled that same-sex intercourse in Northern Ireland should be decriminalized. But recently in 2015, Italy was ruled against and made to recognize the rights of couples married in other parts of the European Union. The Roth Report in '94, which related to human rights across Europe, and the Treaty of Amsterdam signed in 1997 has the impact of banning discrimination across the European Union. And so as states try to join the European Union, they have to ban discrimination. And any states who had discriminatory policies had to remove them. And this has also been extended to counting LGBTQ status as grounds for seeking asylum across Europe.